I wanted to watch this conversation that Hasan had with Bernie Sanders' former foreign policy advisor, Matt Duss. We've had Matt Duss on the stream before to talk about Ukraine. So I thought that knowing that Matt Duss is a Ukrainian American, knowing that he believes that nation states have a right to sovereignty and that we had a responsibility to support Ukraine at the time, and knowing that there are probably some key differences between the two, even though I would say that, there are other differences maybe that, they would probably maybe find some alignment on, but I know for sure that there would be some key differences here if they were to really boil it down. I thought it'd be really interesting to check out the section where they talked about Ukraine, because I heard there was some pushback on the idea of Ukraine being a proxy state for the United States in reference to this war. And him not agreeing and saying that, look, I think that framing kind of, disempowers the Ukrainian perspective. And I think that's interesting. And I wanted to watch this to see if there was either anything I could add or just the fact that, honestly, I just wanted to check it out.
Let's talk Ukraine. Okay. So, Ukraine. Some people like Tim Pool have called it the enemy of the United States.
Oh, my goodness. Normal.
I do not have this mindset, of course. I feel like it's been a litany of policy, a string of policy failures overall. And I do think that there were exit ramps, but I fear that it's an unsalvageable situation that the Trump administration is making even worse than the Biden administration. What do you think is going to happen at these summits by your estimation?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly don't really know because I mean, this summit is, let's just say Donald Trump is not a traditional foreign policy leader, to put it lightly. I mean, a summit of this kind, you would have seen at least some real work being done at the lower level by kind of lower level diplomats from both sides to kind of hammer out an agenda and a set of kind of key, discussion points and a general expectation of what you're going to try to get out of it. Whereas Trump is just kind of charging in and saying, I want to end the war. I want to get a ceasefire. And if Putin doesn't agree to it, then, basically something bad will happen. I'll also say, like, I don't necessarily see that as a criticism. I mean, I think there's sometimes good reason to do non-traditional foreign policy. Like when Trump with Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, back in I think it was 2018, a lot of people criticized.
I loved it.
Bernie was one of the people who didn't.
Yeah,
it was like we should be talking. We should be talking to our adversaries. Diplomacy is good.
I mean, I have no problem with talking to the North Koreans. They have an atomic arsenal. You have to acknowledge a certain amount of power that they have, and like at least military peer-to-peer communication. But I don't understand the purpose of going around and doing all the PR show with shaking their hand if the only follow-up you're going to have after that and giving them all of that, legitimacy, breaking that type of ice cold diplomacy kind of like lock we've had for a long time, just to go up and say, hey, how about you give us all your nukes and we'll give you McDonald's on every street corner. It's not that necessarily the attempt itself was wrong. It's the way it was executed was so bad that it makes the attempt itself bad. It's like, it's not that it's bad that you shot for the hoop. It's just all you did was pelt a child in the stands with a basketball. It's not how you do it.
But the question is what you get out of it.
Yeah.
And I think that's the question to have here. What is Trump hoping to get out of it? Clearly, he, came into office saying, oh, it'll be easy to get peace in Ukraine. This will take me 24 hours. I'll go in. I'll kind of push the Ukrainians to make an agreement. I have a good relationship with Putin. He found out it's a bit more complicated than that. Even though I really didn't enjoy watching the kind of brutal treatment of Zelensky in the Oval Office, the kind of upshot of Trump really, strong-arming the Ukrainians into agreeing to ceasefire talks is that he's revealed once again that Zelensky isn't the problem. Putin is the problem.
Yeah.
It's Putin's choices who are driving this war. And as far as I've seen, Putin has not really changed his goals here. And his goals are, if not necessarily to kind of occupy all of Ukraine, it's to prevent Ukraine's independence. It's to curtail Ukraine's ability to make its own foreign policy and to kind of restore Ukraine to its proper role as he sees it, as kind of this subject within the larger Russian imperium. And if that continues to be his goal, it's hard for me to see what kind of workable agreement could come out of this meeting.
Okay, that's interesting. So you said that Russia's goals in Ukraine might not necessarily be like the entire takeover of Ukraine, which I feel like is a position that
will we ever see another generational run like Stone Cold Steve Austin's What Bit?
No, I do not believe so. You will not. Random, that came out of nowhere, but I don't believe you will. Thank you for the $5.
Ukraine, which I think that Russia's goals in Ukraine might not necessarily be like the entire takeover of Ukraine, which I feel like is a position that other liberal foreign policy wonks would disagree with you on. I think that is, and there is like real fear, I think, from what I've seen from the Western world, liberal capitalist countries in Europe that are worried about an even further incursion of Russia. Like this is a real fear. Whether Russia has the capabilities to do so does not even matter in this equation, even though I feel like that calculation is obvious. They recognize that Russia does not have the capability to do this. Otherwise, Finland and Sweden would not have voided their handshake neutrality agreement and joined NATO. If there was a real imminent fear of Russian invasion, right? I think.
Yeah. This idea that Russia is going to take over Ukraine and then roll tanks into Poland. I mean, that's nonsense. I think the real concern, I think, is that if Russia is able to, achieve its goals in Ukraine, that creates a basis for it to, just spread its influence, its troublemaking, making its presence felt, so to speak, across Europe in a much stronger way. I think that's a legit concern. And that's why we need to kind of figure out some kind of modus vivendi.
Can I just throw out there that that isn't that Russia doesn't want to achieve the complete takeover of Ukraine. It's that they failed at the start of the war and have been trying to achieve whatever they can. If they can't get that, the next best thing. And they've been struggling for whatever they can put together as the next best thing since then. But that doesn't mean that they've completely abandoned the idea. I mean, look at every single... Well, number one, they haven't agreed to any ceasefire. But if you look at any even deal that they entertain or throw out there, all of them include the territories of Kherson and Zaporizhia still being recognized as Russian land, and with still like demilitarization demands, XYZ, nothing that would stop them from invading again or put security apparatuses in place to stop them from invading again. So there's no reason to believe that, considering that Vladimir Putin himself said that he believes, and he said this at the start, and I have no reason to believe that he didn't believe this, that Ukraine can only exist as an extension of Russia or not at all. And there's no reason to believe he's backed off that. And so if that means they can do it in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, they still want to do it. At least he still wants to do that. His government still wants to do it. So whether or not they can achieve that within the next year or two, or within this, before their economy can face real pressure this time around, that doesn't mean that that's a goal that they've abandoned. And that doesn't mean we don't treat that Russian viewpoint as any less of a threat.
But with Russia, I think there were some bad choices made. On the whole, and this is where I've had, an ongoing discussion and debate with some of my brothers and sisters on the left. I think all things considered, Joe Biden handled this fairly well. I think he clearly didn't want this conflict. If you go back to 2021, I think it was June 2021, he actually had a summit with Putin. I mean, his goal for Russia was like, I want to park the Russia relationship over here. We're not going to be friends with Putin, but at least let's have some stability and clarity in the relationship. Because the Biden administration wanted to focus on China. Strategic competition with China was kind of like the obsession. It's a kind of an obsession in Washington generally, but Biden definitely reflected.
I would say
Dude, Hasan's chat is so all over the place, man. Hey, does not look like they like this guy that much.
Started by Barack Obama, by the way. One thing that a lot of people, I think, fail to consider is that even when Donald Trump came into office initially, people were worried that he was going to dismantle NATO. I wasn't worried. I obviously am, I will say, I am anti-NATO for historical reasons. But the idea, the thing that they pointed to was Donald Trump's demands that NATO allies are supposed to give back more of a higher percentage of their GDP to their own defense, buy more American weapons, right? With a higher percentage of their GDP. That was actually an Obama era provision. Yeah. And Donald Trump was really continuing and actually forcing the NATO partners to do that. And clearly it was such a good idea from the foreign policy uniparty mentality that Joe Biden never reversed that decision. He continued along with it as well. And I think now it's gotten to a point where Donald Trump is now demanding even more. They're talking about 5% of these countries' GDPs being spent on American weapons manufacturing. And the European partners are calling him daddy and is saying, sure, we'll do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously, U.S. defense contractors and a lot of people in the U.S. government would prefer that money be spent on U.S. weapons. But the basic demand that Obama kind of elevated was just spend the 2%, however you spend it. Yes, as an American president, I would prefer you spend a lot of this on American weapons.
Dude, it's not just about spending 2%, though. I don't want to like clog up the airways here, but if you spend just more money on the domestic arms manufacturers in the way they're set up now in Europe, you are going to get some more, but a lot of that money is going to be burnt. And where if you could have had an economy of scale for better purchasing power, you could have gotten a lot more for a lot less. Definitely when we're talking about needing more supply of ammunition, more supply, more mass and supply, and not just like more precise missiles, or we need to tweak. What they need is quantity, and they need to get the best bang for their buck for quantity. And that's going to mean coordinating between states to choose the best areas to set up factories for purchasing power parity, and trying to get the most bang for their buck. But that's not always going to be the most domestically pleasing for people who want to bring jobs back specifically to their country. And that isn't going to be necessarily beloved by arms manufacturers who want to be able to, get paid a lot for less.
But the key concern was, these countries need to be spending the agreed upon amount so that they're not over reliant on the United States. It really does get back to when Donald Trump says we're being ripped off. The reason that got traction is because this is a longstanding concern amongst the American public. They feel like our, European allies are kind of free riding on money and security that the United States provides. So, I mean, you're right to bring up the fact that Obama really pressed this originally.
Speaking of Obama, so I'm once again going to go back to Mearsheimer on this issue as well. He's Mr. Realpolitik. He's a big China hawk. Obviously, I have many disagreements with him on that front. But in terms of his analysis on the relationship between the United States of America and Russia, especially as it pertains to Ukraine, I think when he identifies Ukraine as a proxy, a Western proxy, but specifically a proxy for American interests,
Oh, we got a head shake.
I happen to agree with him on this. Like
dude, I don't. This is such baby brain. I'm sorry. I hate to be like this. Mearsheimer got everything wrong. There is nobody more wrong on Ukraine than Mearsheimer. He first said that this war would never happen in the first place. He said it was an impossibility, that there was a million different motivations, that he looked at the motivations, and it was never going to happen. But if it did happen, then Ukraine wouldn't last more than a few weeks, despite Western assistance. That unless the West was to put a bunch of troops on the ground, XYZ, they're not gonna, and he was wrong on that too. And this is because his analysis is flawed. His analysis was flawed because the realist analysis doesn't break down, for example, as much how ideology motivates leaders like Vladimir Putin to engage in offensive wars like this. It does not break down the rot in a government system. If a country's bigger and more powerful, then it's destined to win because it's bigger, more powerful than this much smaller country. That's how the calculus is done. It doesn't look at how the tires in their trucks are rotted because they haven't been well maintained and it's corrupt in XYZ way, or how nationalist fervor on the side of the defender can get tons of the public to pick up guns quick and defend their community. These are things that simply did not enter his analysis. Not to mention, Mearsheimer is somebody who completely removes any attachment to like liberal or democratic principles when talking about the war in Ukraine. He simply sees it as Ukraine is either our proxy or their proxy. Might as well be their proxy. They're closer to it. They might as well have a right to it. And any idea of whether Ukraine should be democratic, whether they should have a civil society, whether they should do this, should do that, all of that is put to the side. He does not care at all in his analysis whatsoever. In fact, he thinks that the people who care about these things are the ones who actually brought about all this doom and gloom in the war in the first place, as a propagation against the Russians, those who care about such things, even if he wants it for himself. So, like, I just don't understand why this guy is treated with so much reverence. I mean, he's another theorist. I don't think he's even a particularly horrible theorist. It's just the amount of reverence he's treated with by leftists who he wouldn't particularly like anyway. It just leaves me so baffled. If he was like the guy who predicted every election or something, well, that ended up not being the case anyway. But if he was like some guy who predicted every election and he had some like magic equation to like predict, then I would understand the reverence. But to be this far into it, having seen the interests and motivations of the Ukrainian people themselves play out at this point, if they did not want to continue to defend their country after almost 4 years of fighting and grinding down with the losses they have taken, they would not be doing so. And so to look at all that motivation and still come back to the Mearsheimer proxy state realpolitik view, it just baffles me. It's just, he hasn't really, like, people tell me he's improved so much since the start of the war, but man, it's hard. It must be on the margins.
Interventions that have happened in Ukraine in terms of like civil society organizations and things like that is a mechanism of the American State Department, and this level of involvement starts with this like holistic, let's make Ukraine more progressive, or let's make this, insert whatever country you want to, more progressive. But then it's like it turns into a way to utilize and maybe even kind of rip apart the sovereignty or whatever sovereignty that these countries might have, not just Ukraine, but every other country, at the behest of America's foreign policy interests, which would be to undermine Russia's attempts of violating Ukrainian sovereignty and bringing Ukraine into its sphere of influence. Would you disagree with that assessment?
I would disagree that, with, treating Ukraine as just a proxy for the United States or for NATO. I think the Ukrainians themselves have wanted to get independence from Russia. I mean, this is a long-standing.
Look, I'll let Matt speak for himself, but all I'll say is this: if the United States disappeared tomorrow, that wouldn't change Putin's view of Ukraine. Instead of the dastardly Americans, it would be the dastardly French. Okay, it would still believe that Ukraine is an extension of Russia, that it can only exist as part of Russia or not at all. And I have no reason to believe that viewpoint would change whatsoever. So if that's the case, that irrespective of the United States even existing, that the Russians would still be treating them the same way, like whether or not the Ukraine wants to be in our sphere of influence or not, like I don't think we're the main factor here. And I don't think our involvement was the main factor here either. I mean, by being in the room, we are part of the equation. But I mean, we are not the dividing line by which this war has started.
Agree that, with, treating Ukraine as just a proxy for the United States or for NATO. I think the Ukrainians themselves have wanted to get independence from Russia. I mean, this is a long-standing, again, just speaking as a Ukrainian myself, this is something I was raised with as well. I mean, when Russians refer to Ukrainians as our little brothers, every Ukrainian knows what that actually means. It's not a compliment. But there has been many efforts going back even before the Soviet Union to achieve Ukrainian independence, with the understanding that there are going to be strong relations between Russia and Ukraine. A lot of Ukrainians are Russian speakers first. I mean, there's obviously family relationships, there's culturally a lot that's shared, but the stuff that USAID is doing, like supporting democracy efforts, supporting civil society efforts. I mean, yes, there's an element of that where the United States obviously is looking to achieve its interests. It wants to bring countries closer to it and farther away from its adversaries. I would not just interpret that as all of this was kind of like this coherent effort just to kind of weaken Russia. I think the Ukrainians themselves have had and still have a strong desire to set up an independent sovereign democracy. And again, that's why I've been supportive of efforts to help them defend themselves. I mean, I want this war to end. The Ukrainians want this war to end more than anyone. But I think referring to Ukraine as a proxy for the United States, really denies the Ukrainians agency in a way that I just don't think is right.
I don't disagree with you on this, by the way. Of course, I think your assessment is completely correct. I see it as converging interests. Ukrainians have always.
Okay, he says that they're a proxy. Matt Duss says they're not a proxy, and Hasan says that he agrees with him. Okay,
correct. I see it as converging interests. Ukrainians have always, in their national history, and you know this a lot better than I do, given your personal background, have always always made their national project to be outside of the sphere of Russian influence, outside of the to have complete sovereignty. So that part I understand, and maybe along the way historically there have been some not so great attempts to do so by some Ukrainians, while the overwhelming majority of Ukrainians were busy, liberating the concentration camps. So, and it happens. I mean, the IRA also, an institution that I am wholeheartedly in favor of, may or may not have in the same time frame thought that they could have allegiances with someone who is an enemy to the British Empire. I won't say who, but both the Ukrainian groups and the IRA had all found themselves in the throes of a dark allegiance, let's say. So I understand, of course, the IRA did not participate in some of the initiatives that the Ukrainian collaborators did initially. So obviously it's not to the same degree, this allegiance. But the point I'm trying to make is that, well, this is converging interest. Like, it's the same as a lot of the former Soviet bloc Eastern European countries that wanted protection and wanted to be rid of any sort of outside influence they were getting from Moscow. Having said that, I think ultimately it almost comes down to the same things that I've said before, which is America was on the right side of this conflict. Ukraine was invaded by a much larger, irredentist regional power, Russia, unjustifiably. But America was on the right side, but it was for the wrong reasons, if that makes sense. Like, I don't think that America's ambitions, I don't think any country's ambitions are moral or immoral. I think they choose to push and pull in a direction that favors their overarching foreign policy goals. And I guess the question I'm going to ask here.
Okay, so Hasan acknowledges that we're on the right side in this, okay? We're on the right side in this war. Fantastic. So he knows we're on the right side, but his position for the entirety of it has still been, don't give them anything to defend themselves. Don't give them any ammunition. Don't give them stuff to shoot down the missiles coming in. I remember him debating Ethan about this, not wanting to add fuel to the fire, quote unquote. But I mean, whether or not, you cannot want to add fuel to the fire. If the Russians are going to keep invading, the Russians are going to keep invading. All you would do is just leave the invaded without a mean to defend themselves, which he now says, they were on the right side. We were on the right side, whether or not it was for good or bad reasons. If I need a gun to defend myself, whether the man I buy one from is motivated by profit or self-defense initiatives, doesn't really matter that much to me, does it? What matters to me is the outcome. And I know Hasan is outcome based. So, I mean, Why is his position still don't supply the Ukraine? I mean, now that we've gotten to this point and Trump's in office, he doesn't want to like cut them off. But why was it that his position was never like put Ukraine in a position to put them in the best negotiating position? Because if we acknowledge that the Russians were the one that aggressed, you got to make it so it's hard for them to aggress. You need to make it so that when they sit down and negotiate, they have to actually consider it because they're in a tough pickle. It feels like Hasan has to acknowledge the position the Ukrainians are in, but has yet to take any of the policy prescriptions or moral necessity that of helping the Ukrainians defend themselves. He took one step but is unwilling to take the other.
Is because of being on the right side, but still ultimately for the wrong reasons, and you might disagree with me on that, and we can talk about that too. Do you feel like there were exit ramps where there could have been more leverage for Ukraine that could have been entertained more? And I think you know exactly what I'm talking about, the Antalya 15-point program that was put forth after the initial pushback by Ukrainian forces and an abject failure of the fake Russian military operation, special military operation that failed to take over Kiev in a matter of weeks, as the initial assessment looked like.
Yeah, I mean, there was a couple things in there. One is to answer your second question first. I see there, I'm not convinced that any of these agreements, the Istanbul agreement or any of these, subsequent agreements, I think they were worth exploring. I think some of them were explored. Could they have been explored more? Yes. But again, at no point along the way have I seen any real evidence that Putin has ultimately changed his goals. I mean, he has stated them pretty clearly, whether or not it's the physical occupation and control of all of Ukraine's territory. It's, creating a Ukrainian government that is subservient to Moscow. I think the United States definitely could have leaned in on, wanting a ceasefire and an agreement, could have leaned in on diplomacy at a few points along the way, not necessarily because I think that would have achieved much, although that is always worth exploring, but because, again, it would have put the onus back on Putin, just as Donald Trump has done in his own way. It just made clear, this.
Okay, I hear Hasan saying, yeah, and this is all nice, but what Matt is telling him is, yeah, we could have talked more, but it almost certainly would have failed. Which has been my main critique of Hasan's. Look, okay, maybe Matt does as a friendlier package than me having the Ukrainians directly critique him in the way that happened. But I mean, it's probably going to fail, and then what? Well, now we've put the emphasis on Putin. We put the ball in his court. Okay. The ball's been in his court since January of this year. What has that changed? What has that changed on the international stage besides the fact that, people might feel a little bit more awkward with Zelensky in the room if they ever called him the problem? So, I mean, I agree that, negotiations tried to the utmost, but if they were almost certainly going to fail, then what do you do if negotiations fail? Well, you have to prepare for them to fail. You need to prepare for that outcome. But if he's acknowledging that they would almost certainly fail, then Hasan's position was negotiate with the Russians. Don't send any more aid to the Ukrainians, any more military aid. Don't add fuel to the fire. Negotiations fail. Then what? Then what? It would be easier if Hasan just readjusted his position publicly to understand exactly where he stands. But it's always this slow slide now that Trump is out there making such of a fool of himself, and maybe it's aesthetically easier and too unavoidable to say that it's clear that the Russians are not that interested in peace. Man,
this is the man whose choices are driving this war. And now going back to what you said about, being on the right side for the wrong reasons, I hear that. Listen, Joe Biden, I mean, even though I think he handled it fairly well, I understand he was doing this because he saw it serving the ends of American primacy. That is not a goal that I agree with. However, the way that I approached it as a progressive, who believes in people's rights to defend themselves, people's rights to independence, in international law, and the right of countries not to be invaded by their more powerful neighbors is a pretty foundational idea in international law. I mean, I saw a set of principles and values that were being upheld by a policy of the U.S. government, even if I didn't go all the way with the reasons why the U.S. government was doing that. And of course, the U.S. government is wildly hypocritical in all of these things. We look no further than Gaza to show where all those same principles and rules and laws were and are being massively violated. But, I mean, people accuse you of, or accuse, each other of whataboutism. They're like, well, we're not doing the right thing here. Why should we do the right thing over there? My approach is I just want to be consistent about these things. The Palestinians should have self-determination and freedom, and the right not to be destroyed, just as the Ukrainians should. And I want my government to uphold those values and those principles consistently.
Yeah. A couple questions for you. I have routinely stated since the invasion that this was also a massive blunder for Vladimir Putin as well. Even though he has obviously been able to successfully gear the entirety of the Russian economy into a war economy and has been able to withstand a lot of the sanctions regime that was immediately implemented. Obviously, there's a lot of secondary markets that Russian energy can still reach Europe through, like India being one of those prime examples. And for me, even if I were to take the security concerns that Vladimir Putin might have had about bringing Ukraine, which is right next to, very close to Moscow, in proximity, and as opposed to many of these other countries, like NATO encroachment. If that was a valid concern, a valid security concern, I think the most successful way to avoid that would be to continue trade dominance and to continue engaging by way of energy trade, like European allies, and make yourself irreplaceable in a way that is not dissimilar to what China has been able to do. A less of an interest in direct intervention, but intervening in the affairs of other countries to create a security window for yourself by making sure that the bigger partners involved are still completely they're beholden to the energy partnership or the trade that you have with Russia.
Yeah.
I think not doing that and then militarily invading Ukraine was a major mistake that actually emboldened.
Europe was very economically integrated with Russia. I mean, if it was to a point where the Russian economy could not function without the European economy, maybe it would have gone differently. But the Europeans were heavily reliant on Russian energy imports. They were trading with the Russians very regularly. I mean, Nord Stream 2 was getting up and running. I mean, that was being pushed forward. So when he talks about if they were more integrated, they were integrated. They were integrated. How much more integrated would they have had to be? I guess significantly more to have prevented that invasion. But as much as, that might have disincentivized somebody from invading, that also disincentivized people from responding with force, which was always the fear about what will Europe do now that the trigger has been pulled.
NATO, and that's the reason why you saw Finland and Sweden join NATO as well, especially because it was also a failure in terms of a military invasion as well, which showed that Russia was wholly incapable of being a serious threat beyond the obvious nuclear threat. And that I think,
Russia absolutely can still be a serious threat. I mean, Russia has this tremendous ability to continue to bang its head off the wall and learn through immense pain. It did that in Finland during the Soviet period too. After the Soviet invasion of Finland, a lot of countries probably looked at the Soviet Union and ha 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 ha, how badly that went. But they learned, they grew, and they improved. Same when it talks about the initial Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. They reform, and they have reformed. That doesn't mean that they're some invincible Superman, but we should also not underestimate.
I mean, the explosion of Nord Stream as well, obviously. So there are numerous other failures here, but as it stands now, it feels like from what I have seen on the battle lines, the Russian positions hardening on eastern Ukraine, and they're making more territorial gains as well right now as we speak in the lead up to this summit. It feels like Russia sees this as having the upper hand. And I think that everything that I've read, as far as like the problems that the Ukrainian defense has, means that there is this impossible problem that Ukraine has in terms of manpower. And I don't know if there's any reasonable way to make up for that shortage, because it's not necessarily like having the most the best technology or the best like defensive or offensive weapons, or even like limiting Ukraine's like targeting capabilities of like hitting inside of Russian territory. Perhaps it could have been helpful early on, but it seems like at this stage it doesn't matter. Do you agree with that assessment, or do you?
There's still more people they can recruit. There's still more people that are being recruited, and that shows through 75% of the army being conscripts. There's a certain amount of the youth that they could still dip into, but they've been extremely hesitant to do that. And due to the nature of how the battlefield is now and how much territory drones can cover, you need less men to cover less territory, making it so while they are losing ground, they are making it a lot of casualties to take that ground. They do still need more men, but it would be easier for them to hold on every front if the Ukrainians had more ammunition, if the Ukrainians had more armor, if the Ukrainians had more of the gear that they need to go out there and fight. It certainly isn't just a situation where, well, you just need more bodies. That's the main problem. That's one of the problems. And I would say if they had the good gear necessary to defend themselves, where people aren't driving civilian vehicles up to the contact line to do troop deployments, it'd probably be easier to get more recruits.
I feel like there's an alternative vision here that I'm not seeing. Or do you feel like there's an alternative vision here that I'm not seeing?
Well, I think we're in a situation right now. I mean, first of all, going back, agreeing with you that this was initially a huge blunder and an embarrassment. And also it's put Russia in a relationship with China, which I guess I won't call a vassal relationship, but a really subservient relationship with China. That's really not something that I think Putin wanted. But he has shown the ability to reconstitute it, his military force to recruit, to strengthen over the past years with Chinese help, with Iranian help, with others' help. That is impressive. There's no other way about it. And time is on Russia's side now. I mean, I think that is the brutal reality. So that's the question we're faced with. If Putin hasn't changed his mind, what do we do? Do we say, okay, we're no longer supporting this? The United States will withdraw, or at least we'll lower the amount of arms and support we're willing to give. Europe will try to make up the difference. They can't do that in the short term. Everyone understands that. And slowly and then more quickly, Ukraine will start to lose. So if people understand that, then they should say so. I mean, I guess I'm not someone who has ever, kind of bought into this idea that, global democracy and American security will live or die in Ukraine. I don't think I've never wanted to kind of make these kind of wild existential claims about the importance of this conflict. As I said, I think there are important.
I do think, though, in front of this audience, establishing it as important and saying why there is stakes for American security, why there is stakes for America's reputation in the conflict in the first place, probably in a room that doesn't really hear about those stakes, period. Not that I think much in that room might care about that credibility.
Values and principles that do impact America's security and prosperity that are at play here. I don't want to overstate those. I think a lot of people do that, and it's a mistake. But I think if Putin hasn't changed his mind and still wants to achieve those goals, he will do so in the absence of continuing U.S. support.
Europe is our largest trading partner. Stability in Europe is good for the United States. Anytime war spirals out in Europe, it ends up sucking in the United States. It was true during World War I. It was true during World War II. And I think it would be true during any prospective World War III. There is an interest in keeping up American credibility when it comes to the security guarantees we gave Ukraine. There's an interest in the keeping up of the credibility of those who give up atomic weapons, having their territory respected, especially if we're involved. If we don't want to make it normalized, the offensive territorial wars of conquest backed by atomic weapons, and that the nation states that give up atomic weapons will be torn limb from limb, motivating many states to take another look at the atomic bug. I think that there are clear motivations for the United States that are useful to articulate in these rooms. That's not even talking about any personal, what can the defense sector learn from Ukrainian innovation? That's all really besides the point.
So let's talk about a reasonable and just solution. Obviously, the most just solution in this would be the immediate cessation of hostilities, and then Russian forces pulling out of eastern Ukraine, and even taking it one step further, even like the Crimea question comes to mind. Obviously, at this stage, I think in 2025, even the American government's position is that like Crimea is a lost cause, and that the permanent annexation is if not de facto, de jure recognized, right? Like almost legally almost a legal recognition is imminent. It's also from a foreign power, an autonomous sovereign foreign power mentality. Like that reason is for Sevastopol and an entry into the Black Sea for Russia. They have their reasons for this. But having said that, I think, as you also brought up, China plays a major role in this. And I feel like the American attitude against China is actually causing us to not find the most just, most equitable solution that we could potentially get. Because I think the pathway to a
Dude, why is this always the thing he brings up? Dude, speaking Chinese in negotiations or doing it in Beijing isn't going to change anything about what's happening right now. It really isn't going to change much. I mean, it could be another venue, but I don't think right now the reasons why negotiations are failing is going to be affected by getting the Chinese involved. Unless you can see the Chinese see a direct interest in forcing the Russians to come through a halt through saying they'll put their gas purchases on the line.
A meaningful resolution of this conflict also revolves around bringing China to the table. Do you disagree with that?
I don't disagree, but I think there have been efforts made to get China to play a better brokering role. I think there's been efforts by others as well. I mean, like Lula, and who took a shot at this, and I think that was great. I think we want countries like Brazil, which is a rising country, big economy, a lot of influence, especially in
Lula did not do a fantastic job, though. I mean, he just kind of swung for the fences, and that was really it.
the developing world. I think that was really important. He wasn't able to do it. So yeah, what I understand from China's behavior is that China is right now just not really interested in doing that. I think we should continue to explore that, because yeah, if
To be clear, Lula da Silva said that Zelensky was as responsible for the war as Putin. Like, he is somebody who claims to be an anti-imperialist, but is as comfortable blaming the people getting conquered as the conqueror when looking at these wars. I mean, that doesn't mean that Brazil cannot be a venue by which talks can occur, but like, I don't think Lula da Silva really deserves any credit.
If it told Putin, you're out of runway, I think that would really change the game. But as far as I can see, they have not, made that decision yet. So
the reason you brought up the China-Brazil proposal, right? That's what you were referencing, because they had a joint statement on the Ukraine crisis that was delivered on May 13th. But even before then, in May 13th, 2025, but even before then, they had a joint cooperative security agreement that actually offered like limited concessions to Russia, from what I understand, and was, ironically enough, in the rearview mirror, when we look at like what Trump has designed for Ukraine, a far better solution, a far more equitable outcome for Ukraine and Ukrainian independence.
And what was that? What are they even talking about? I mean, when he says that Brazil and China offered a peace plan that was much better than Trump's, what peace plan is he referring to? Like, if I was to, like, if I look at the letters by which they, because we do have something here. I think I had a letter pulled up earlier. I had one earlier. It's, I mean, we can just look this up now, honestly, because I don't particularly remember them putting forward a peace deal of Brazil Ukraine peace plan. We can just look it up right now. Here it is. I will read it for all of you at home. Brazil and China present joint proposal for peace negotiations with participation of Russia and Ukraine. Number 1, the two sides shall call on all relevant parties to observe 3 principles for de-escalating the situation. Don't expand the battlefield. No escalation of the fighting. No provocation. The two sides believe that dialogue and negotiation are the only viable solution. Okay, so they should talk. 3, efforts are needed to increase humanitarian assistance. Attacks on civilians must be avoided, and prisoners of war protected. 4, no use of nuclear weapons. 5, attacks on nuclear power plants and peaceful facilities should be opposed. 6, dividing the world into isolated political and economic groups should be opposed. The two sides call for efforts to enhance international cooperation on energy, finance, trade, and food security. What is he talking? This isn't a deal. This is just like a means by which they think talks could maybe work. These are just like a bunch of bullet points by which, like, hey, if you didn't execute POWs, negotiations might go better. This isn't a deal. Like when it says, okay, let me read the article he has on screen. China, Brazil press on with Ukraine. China, Brazil on Friday pressed ahead with an effort to gather developing countries behind a plan to end the war in Ukraine, despite Ukrainian Volodymyr Zelensky's dismissal of the initiative as serving Moscow's interests. Touts Brazil-China plan for Ukraine-Russia talks. Okay, his 6-point plan. Lula, who has spoken to Russian President Putin, did not give any details of his 6-point plan in his speech at the opening at the UN General Assembly. Is there anything else here that I'm missing, that I'm forgetting about this fantastic plan? Because I could just find that one article. Friendship for Peace, group on crisis setup. Is there something I'm missing? Can somebody in chat please tell me? Because I might have to make my editor edit all this out, because I'm pretty sure, like, I'm digging around and I can't find anything else. Yeah, no, none of this deals with the issues that started the war. It's all just says, let's have a ceasefire and a peace talk. Like, none of this would have, I don't see how any of this would have changed anything. Whatever. Okay, let me find it. Non-escalation, direct negotiation, and international peace conference accepted by both Russia and Ukraine, and discussion of all peace plans. Humanitarian assistance, exchange of prisoner of war, no attacks on civilians, no use of weapons of mass destruction. Yeah, no, there was no framework by which here's the new things that we will agree to. It was just like, here's a 6-point plan by which how we can start negotiations. So I don't see how this would have changed anything, really. If the Russians are the same Russians that are invading now as was invading then.
Right.
I guess the question that I have always is, like, you say that China has no interest in this or has no investment in this, and I think you could even say that about Israel as well. China is a very significant trade partner to Israel. It could literally take action, almost single-handedly take action against Israel if it truly wanted to, beyond stern warnings and sternly worded letters against Israel's position. But I still think that, just like with Israel, and especially with Ukraine as well, American involvement moving in one direction makes it virtually impossible. And I think it's incumbent on us to bring China to the table, is what I mean.
I hear that.
Because they are the senior partner in this coalition on the Russian side, and because they just love trading. They love trading more than anything else. And I think that, like, on the one hand, there's this idea that, like, Russia is seen as like the militant, like, anti-West country, the only country that has the capability to even strike a blow at whatever Western interests are, versus China is seemingly disinterested in doing that, like militarily, I mean, and therefore they're just like kicking back and watching events as they unfold, because You know, it's not in their they're disinterested in pushing for a reasonable solution. But the other attitude is that, like, at least historically, what China has done in contemporary Chinese history, in modern day Chinese history, they have taken a non-interventionist and a non-interventionist approach.
He's just giving me a bunch of reasons as to why China would not feel particularly interested in going out of its way to make peace happen.
In almost every single circumstance, with the hopes that they could just like keep selling.
And we're not even talking about like the amount of weapons that they're selling to the Russians and drones and stuff.
Approach in almost every single circumstance, with the hopes that they could just like keep selling labubus to everyone, including in Ukraine. So if there's interest for peace from China, I feel like America could grease the wheels a little bit, or to at least like symbolically say, here, let's bring you to the table if they truly were invested in a equitable outcome here.
No, I think that's right. But I would agree. I agree with pretty much everything you said, but I would add this too from China's perspective. China benefits from the United States bleeding resources and credibility, especially in Gaza, in the Middle East, but also in Ukraine, and not being able to not being seen as able to kind of bring this war to an end. So that's kind of a cynical angle, but I do think it's a realistic part of this. But I would agree. I mean, efforts should be made. I think some have been made, but we should keep pressing, to get China involved, because it's going to have to. Ultimately, it will have to play a role in any resolution of this. But going back to what you had asked about, what does a real agreement look like? Listen, if we just cut, said, stop fighting right now. The lines are where they are. Russia retains control of, essentially the eastern third of Ukraine. Not only do I think we should go for that, I think Ukraine would go for that. The question is, okay, how is that durable? And what guarantee?
Also, how do you even get there if the Russians are still demanding the Ukrainians withdraw from territory they haven't conquered? Again, this is where you take a policy action.
Exist, what mechanisms exist to ensure that this is not just a pause while Russia kind of gets its back together and prepares for the next round of possibly even worse fighting, but just say, okay, this war is now over. Russia will retain control of these regions, Crimea, Donbass, but Ukraine will retain its sovereignty and independence.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I mean, I think like, maybe we'll disagree on this, but I think the Minsk agreements initially were a far more favorable off-ramp if implemented correctly, or if they were actually implemented at all, as opposed to the 15-point plan in Turkey, another off-ramp, as opposed to where we're at right now.
Again, demilitarization, we've talked about this in reference to Hasan, when it comes to a 15-point plan and what the Russians were pushing, as far as I know, they never gave up on demilitarization. And if they never gave up on demilitarization, then how can you expect the Ukrainians to agree to demilitarize their state after being invaded back to back like that? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense for you to try to keep your country alive in these circumstances to then give up the armed force that just stopped the Russians from taking your capital. As for back in the Minsk agreements, they tried and they failed. They were Minsk 1 and they were Minsk 2. So if Minsk 1 and Minsk 2 failed, I mean, we could say like it would have been better if the war stayed in that part of the country instead of expanding to even larger parts of the country. But the Russians decided that that was not where it was going to stop, and they started the war in 2022. They expanded, well, didn't start the war, but expanded the war in 2022. So I don't really see what, like for example, when we say it was a better jumping off point, does that mean we should have made the Ukrainians try harder? Was that what we're saying the problem is? Or are we just saying it would have been nice if the war jumped off from there? It would have been nice if it didn't happen in the first place. But if the Russians were not willing to withdraw their troops, and when they were told, because they said in the Minsk agreements, fine, we'll do this election, we'll do this, we'll do that, we'll do all these things, and we agree. But then the Russians, when they were saying, okay, you need to withdraw your troops, they said, what troops? What troops? Troops? We don't have troops there, which they did. And since they refused to even acknowledge that they had the troops there, how can they withdraw something that they refused to acknowledge they even had? It was doomed before it even really began. So when we say it was a better jumping off point, I just wanted to, in like what way? If we were able to get over that hurdle, if we were able to do what? And not to mention, the Minsk agreement was put in place at the barrel of the gun from the Russians in a way that didn't really resolve it for the long term. And it still didn't get through.
Where, as you've also said, the Ukrainian appetite for continuing to defend its borders militarily has completely swung in the opposite direction, with 69% of Ukrainians now saying, like, we want a ceasefire, even though the majority of Ukrainians don't think it's going to happen as well in the same Gallup polls. Right. So
vital context is to say that when they say they want a ceasefire, they want a ceasefire, but they're also not willing to accept the cessation of hostilities on Russian terms. So most people want an end to the fighting, but they also aren't willing to make the sacrifice of surrender to the Russians in order to make it stop. So that means they might be willing to make some compromises, but so far the Russians haven't been able to make any of the requisite compromises that would be necessary to convince them.
Yeah, I don't see a just or equitable outcome here for Ukraine at all, no matter what happens, unfortunately, because I just don't think that any of the Western powers are like genuinely interested in allowing Ukraine to have any semblance of sovereignty, and that even the European leaders who have seemingly been reliable allies to Ukraine in this process, at least in the way that they communicate on this, have done so only because they're just like afraid of, I guess, further Russian incursion or what they think is like the American attitudes, American interests that they're relitigating.
I mean, I would say that, yeah, there is a truth to the fact that many European powers just see Ukraine almost like a shield to hold up against the Russians, and that's very sad. One way to not do that is to take policy actions that can empower the Ukrainians, policy actions that, again, Hasan has dragged his feet on since the very beginning.
Do you feel like there is like what do you think is going to come out of these talks is I guess what I'm going back to now that we've talked about this.
I don't know, but I think, Trump is kind of dangling, renormalizing relationships between the United States and Russia, or at least improving those relationships. I can see how that might be attractive to Putin. Putin, sees Russia as having kind of an historic right to play a role as a great power on the global stage. I think that is something that could potentially incentivize him to make some agreement here. That's a real deliverable for him. So again, it's possible. But the question is, okay, in exchange for that, are you willing to really give up on your kind of grand goal of, kind of destroying Ukraine's independence? Can you agree to a smaller Ukraine that is genuinely independent, that obviously is going to have, closer relationships with Europe, and that has a military that can defend itself? There can be agreements made on the types and the size of weapons and all that kind of stuff. But I think that's kind of the most realistic, decent outcome at this point. But I'm kind of skeptical that we'll see it in the next couple of days, although maybe the groundwork could start to be laid for those, talks to progress.
Do you think that Russia has the capacity to hold militarily Eastern Ukraine, or do you think that there will be a lot of impossible American-style counterinsurgency initiatives that they will have to do, which will make it virtually impossible for them and will inevitably cripple their economy and will consistently be a headache from their perspective, from the Russian perspective, because of the understandable desire that Ukrainian elements will have in the region if they still are living there to consistently fight back against Russian forces?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like I said, Russia has shown the ability to recruit and to reconstitute kind of its material, and it also, has no compunction about fighting a pretty savage war. And that would be a pretty savage counterinsurgency. But as we've seen, savage counterinsurgencies often fail, and they produce the exact opposite outcome, precisely because they're so savage. Um, I don't know. I think partly that would, we'd have to see what kind of agreement was made for the rest of Ukraine. If there's the possibility, people picking up and leaving, the homes and communities that they've lived in for generations for the other part of Ukraine, if they want to stay Ukrainian, is not the best outcome. Forcing people to leave either voluntarily or not is always pretty brutal. But again, I think that the nature of any counterinsurgency would kind of hinge on what the rest of Ukraine looks like and what its future looks like.
It will also depend upon whether or not the Ukrainian government could sustain it, because again, the Russians are going to be very, very focused on suppressing any insurgency effort done by locals or sponsored by the outside. And so, if it's going to have any chance of success, it will have to be sponsored directly by Kiev with resources, intelligence, and the weapons necessary to engage in insurgency, which would then become a potential flashpoint for a future conflict, which of course is scary in and of itself. But yeah, this is something that we've talked about before. That just because there's a formal peace agreement doesn't mean that you get peace. Or I guess it really depends on your definition of peace. Is people going door to door, taking people and arresting them due to pro-Ukrainian loyalties? Is that peace? Are summary executions peace? Is mass torture peace? Is it peace for that type of fighting to exist where people start making little militias and groups to fight back against the government, and the government then, the occupation government then responds with force and brutality? Is that peace? Um, Peace is what you make of it. And as for this conversation, I think that Hasan got probably the most pushback he's ever gotten, and that is in part due to the fact that he brought on somebody serious who was able to engage on the topic, and does have some Ukrainian roots that he can call back upon. I still wish that he would talk to somebody who's been in Ukraine during the war. As Ukrainians who live there, there are tons of them who would probably be willing to speak to him at a moment's notice. That's still something I want, because as intelligent as Matt Duss is, there's a certain perspective that you can only get by living it, and that people who live outside of Ukraine and people who live in Ukraine during the war and before the war have two very, 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 very different experiences. So I think that would still be very useful. I still don't think he's willing to take the policy prescriptions necessary to make any of this workable. It seems like he's almost deliberately avoiding like the asks of the actions that need to be taken, either due to he feels uncomfortable saying it or otherwise. And besides that, I mean, I think that like talking about all these other points where we could have jumped off and jumped here, it's very hopeful. And I mean, I appreciate a certain amount of hopefulness about the perspective of different opportunities we had for peace. But I also don't want this to become naivete about who exactly we're negotiating with or what they're interested in. For example, like opening up with, oh, so you're saying that, that the Russians actually don't want to take all of Ukraine. Again, they'll take as much as they can get away with and then see if they can come back later and take more. That's how they've engaged the whole war. That's how they'll continue to engage in the future. Hopefully Hasan in the future will have more conversations with people who don't exactly see eye to eye with him on this. Again, somebody from over there would be great. Okay. The talk isn't specific enough? Yeah, no. It needs to get more into specifics. It does need to get more into specifics.